Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kikuyo. Thanks for joining me for Dharma Sunday. The title of today's talk is Joe Rogan and the Danger of Free Speech. Before we get into that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. If you're not familiar with podcaster Joe Rogan, he runs probably the biggest podcast in the world called The Joe Rogan Experience. It gets millions of listens on every episode. He recently got a $100 million deal from Spotify. In addition to that, he has a long career as a comedian, and he's an announcer for the UFC. So until recently, life was going pretty good for Joe Rogan until a clip came out on the internet that included many instances of him using the N-word while speaking with guests on his podcast. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the use of racial slurs and profane speech. I'm going to talk about the Buddhist teaching of right speech and a little bit more about the standard we should hold ourselves as spiritual practitioners when we're using our words in day-to-day life. But given the charged nature of the topic, I think a few disclaimers are in order. Now, I personally am a strong believer in freedom of speech and the Constitution as a whole. In fact, I believe in the Constitution so much that I spent 8 years of my life defending it in the U.S. Marines. More than that, I'm a Buddhist in a predominantly Christian country. Without the right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all of which are encoded in the Constitution, I and people like me would be in a lot of trouble. So if the question is, do I think anyone's right to speech should be censored? The answer is no. I believe we should err on the side of freedom as far as the government is concerned, and that individuals should decide what standard they want to hold themselves to within that freedom that we're given. Some people, however, are taking the treatment that Joe Rogan is experiencing and saying that it's unfair because, well, rappers use that word all the time. Sort of, they get to say it, so why can't we? And that to me is a very strange moral calculus. Other people cheat on their wives, so why can't I? Other people play in traffic, so why can't I? Other people light forest fires, so why can't I? If the only standard we hold ourselves to is what am I allowed to do in daily life? What can I do without the government coming and arresting me? Well, we're not really holding ourselves to much of a standard at all. And I personally don't believe that just because other people are doing a bad or wrong thing, that gives us license to also do that bad or wrong thing. I'll end by saying, and I don't know the man personally, but I don't believe that Joe Rogan is a racist. And what I mean by that is I don't think there are white robes or swastikas sitting around in his house. I think he was leaning into that edgy bro persona that he's cultivated for himself as a comedian. We're not supposed to say this word, but rappers say it, so I'm gonna say it. Ha ha ha. And he got caught. So is he allowed to say that? Does it fall under freedom of speech? Absolutely. Are people right to be angry that he said it? Absolutely. So what's the lesson here? I think the first thing we need to understand is that there is a difference between can do in day-to-day life and should do in day-to-day life. Like I alluded to earlier, the Constitution says we can do a lot of things. It gives us a great deal of freedom, especially when it comes to our speech. Which is why Buddhist doctrine is so important, because it gives us guidance on what we should do with that freedom, how we can best use our freedom of speech to end suffering for ourselves and others. And there are lots of shoulds in Buddhism. How we should enter the meditation hall, how we should sit on the cushion, how we should speak to other people. And there are so many shoulds because freedom is a beautiful thing, but it's also a dangerous thing. This is especially true of freedom of speech, which is a lot like fire in my estimation. If you ever sat around a fire in the woods, a campfire, let's say, it's wonderful. There's a nice soft glow, it keeps you warm, stirs conversation amongst the group. If used correctly, fire is great, but it's also dangerous, so dangerous in fact that it can burn our house down. So if I were to light a match next to an empty or a full canister of gasoline and say, well, I have the freedom to do this. Sure, I have the freedom to do it, but is it the right thing to do? Is it the smart thing to do? To engage in this action that can potentially cause harm, not just to myself, but also to other people? Now, some people might be thinking that I'm overstating the point, that I'm equating the physical harm that can come from fire to the mental and spiritual harm that can come from incorrect speech. But Buddhism sees it differently. In Buddhism, we're taught that hateful words lead to hateful thoughts, and that leads to hateful actions. They build and support each other. So the secular world says that I personally can hurl a spew of profanities at someone, and as long as I don't put my hands on them, it's fine. Buddhism says differently. In Buddhism, we are taught that we must use peaceful words, because peaceful words lead to peaceful thoughts lead to peaceful actions. This is why Buddhist practices like chanting and sutra study are so important, because we believe that if we read the Buddha's words, we'll begin to behave like Buddhas. If we chant for the benefit of all sentient beings, we'll inevitably develop compassion for those sentient beings. This is why the metta meditation is so important. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, may you be loved. We say those words over and over and over again because we know if we say them enough times, we'll begin to feel them in our hearts. And then once we feel them in our hearts, we'll begin to act on them in the world. I cannot overstate the importance of words and the correct use of speech in day-to-day life. It's not a question of can we do something. It's a question of should. And we know this intuitively even outside of Buddhism. There's a reason that people recite vows on their wedding day. And they invite a bunch of people there to hear them say those words. There's a reason that we as individuals say, I love you to friends and family members at the end of a visit. And there's a reason we get so offended if someone gives us the silent treatment. If they hang up the phone without saying goodbye. Because we understand in our hearts, even if we don't want to admit it, in our brains, that speech has power. So much so that our country, the United States of America, wouldn't exist without the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Just words on a piece of paper. Speech in our Constitution. But how different would our country be if those words weren't there? If our founders had used their speech differently? It's not a question of can, it's a question of should. And Buddha understood that 2,600 years ago, which is why he made right speech the first noble tenet of the Noble Eightfold Path. It came before right action, it came before right livelihood, it even became before the mindfulness and meditation practices we normally associate with Buddhist training. Buddha sat down in meditation under the Bodhi tree, realized enlightenment, stood up, and the first thing he tells people to do is be careful how you speak to each other. Because our speech is the conduit for everything else. Now that said, what is right speech? Well, according to Buddhism, right speech is words that remove suffering and bring joy to others, in a very broad sense. If we want more specific instruction, we're told in the sutras that we should abstain from false speech. We cannot tell lies. We should not slander others or speak in ways that cause disharmony in the group. We must abstain from rude, impolite, or abusive language. And that we should not indulge in idle talk or gossip. So, with these tenets in mind, I invite everyone watching to ask themselves, how am I using my speech? Am I being rude, impolite, or abusive? Is this message I'm typing on social media going to lift people up? Or is it going to tear them down? Is the joke I'm about to tell to other people hurtful to other people in the room? Am I punching down in hopes of gaining a few laughs? Again, I am not questioning anyone's right to say things. I'll keep saying it. It is not a question of can in Buddha Dharma. It's a question of should. Should we do this thing if we are serious about trying to end suffering for ourselves as others? So if the question is, do I believe that the government should arrest anyone who uses racial slurs? Absolutely not. I am saying that we should not use racial slurs in any context for any reason. And look, I'm a Buddhist teacher. Maybe I'm a bit of a prude. I also don't believe that we should eat meat or use drugs or drink alcohol. So you can take my word with a grain of salt. But I want to make that clear. I am not saying that anyone's freedom of speech should be infringed upon. What I am saying that as Buddhists, we should hold ourselves to a higher standard than, will the government arrest me if I say this thing out loud? I am saying that as Buddhists, we must respect and understand the connection between speech, thoughts, and actions. And I am saying that as Buddhists, we need to understand the purification of body, speech, and mind are paramount on our walk towards enlightenment. And if we're serious about waking up from the illusion of a separate self, at a minimum, an absolute minimum, racial slurs should not be part of our vocabulary. Now, that said, some people disagree with me, and that's fine. This is America, you're allowed to do that. And even as I was preparing this talk, I thought about some of the possible reactions that people might have. Now, some people will think that I'm overreacting. It's just a joke. Joe Rogan is a comedian. He has the right to tell jokes on his podcast. And like I said, he's the biggest podcaster in the world, so apparently whatever he's doing is working. And I agree. He has the right to say whatever he wants on his podcast. And I have the right to dislike it. Other people might think that I'm not reacting strongly enough. That I should be saying more. And I get it. I get it. I had a lot of emotions when I watched that clip. Racial slurs, the N-word in particular, are ugly. They're divisive. They're a nasty part of our country's history. Whether they're directed at black people or any ethnic group for that matter. But as a Buddhist teacher, I try to walk a line and take my own personal feelings out of the equation as much as possible and really focus in on the teachings of Buddha. That's worked for me so far. So I don't think I can give this talk in a way that makes everyone happy. But that said, I do invite people to engage in a mindfulness practice that I find helpful when it comes to speech, especially the tenet of right speech as taught in Buddhism. Each time we want to say something and we're feeling any sort of emotional charge, count to 5, and I ask myself, will my words help people or hurt people? Then I ask myself, is this the best way to say what I want to say? And what I've personally found, and I think you'll find this too, is we end up speaking less throughout the day, but our words become more skillful, more impactful, and more beneficial both to ourselves and to the people around us. Amitabha. So, that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. I'll just end with a few announcements. So, this was Dharma Sunday. We do it every Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it's just me taking some topic from the news or pop culture and speaking on it from the Buddhist perspective. On Wednesdays, we do something a little bit more involved. That's meditation and sutra study. And that involves me reading from Buddhist scripture and then giving a Dharma talk. That again happens every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, broadcast from this channel. So I hope to see you there. Until next time. Amitabha.